Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts, and I'm super excited to be here with Heather B. Moore, who wrote the book Julia about who else? Julia Child. And we're going to learn all about Heather and Julia in just a little bit because, Julia is just fascinating, and I think there's always stories to be told about her. So just a couple things. I want to say thanks to the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programs. We couldn't do it without them. I'd like to thank Heather for letting us share this program with other libraries because, of course, when libraries work together, we make magic. And you can buy signed books by Heather from Aesop's Fable, our very favorite local indie bookstore. I'll put a link to that in my recap email. And, I just think signed books are gold. I think a lot of people think the same thing because I don't think I'm alone in that. And Julia is going to have like a 30-minute presentation with slides. I will be off screen at that time, but I will be paying attention. So if anything comes up tech-wise, just let me know. I will turn the chat off during the slides just so that nobody's distracted, but I'll turn it back on when when the slides are done so you can chat with each other. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen where if you have questions at any time, just put it in there, and that's where I'll be moderating the questions from. So like I said, Heather, she contacted me, I think, like about 6 months ago, and I just pulled her into everything. Like she did an online auction with us. She's doing this program with us. I've talked to her about some other things. She's just amazing. And then she's a writer who's written over 90 publications. And I think the most interesting thing that I got from her bio was that she writes under all these, like she writes all of these different various genres of books. She writes women's fiction, romance, inspirational nonfiction, speculative fiction. What don't you write, Heather?
Well, I don't write horror. Well,
Oh,
I don't think I do. I write the
okay.
scary stuff.
I'm good with that because I'm a total weenie. But thank you so much for doing this. I'm really, really pleased to be able to finally chat with you.
Well, thank you so much, Mina. It's been so fun just to talk to you for a few minutes before this started. And I really enjoyed just emailing you back and forth. And I appreciate this opportunity because I am a little bit of I guess, a wide-eyed person when it comes to Boston, just from the research I did on Julia Child's life. And also I was actually born in Rhode Island, Providence, Rhode Island. I lived there for about a year before I was brought to Utah by my parents. My dad was getting his PhD at Brown University. And so I had actually mentioned this to Mina right before we started, is a couple years ago, I was able to come out and visit Salem, which was definitely on my bucket list because my 10th great grandmother was one of the ones that was accused of witchcraft during the Salem witch trials. And so I had written a historical novel about her maybe 7 years ago. And I remember this email very clearly. It was in 2019, and I received an email from the Salem Witch Museum. And I was like, okay, this is out of the blue. And just something in me said, I wonder if they want to carry your book in their museum. And they did. And I was so excited. This was actually a self-published book I had done. So would send them copies every so often when they put in an order. And in 2023, I flew into Boston with my youngest daughter, and we spent several days in Salem, and I did every single tour I could think of. And I did a book signing at the museum, and it was really fun. And I just keep thinking about it, and I want to go back. Anyway, so we'll get to the point here. Sorry. So I have written this book, of course, as you know, on Julia, and it was an interesting process because I had written two other World War II novels. And so the focus of this book originally was going to be Julia's service in World War II, which took place in Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. And my publisher had just thought, okay, you're going to write another World War II book. But as I started doing the research, I thought, okay, everyone that reads this book, they're going to be disappointed that there's not anything about her becoming this amazing cook and amazing cookbook author. And I would say chef, but she didn't like calling herself chef. Anyway, so I have a few, let's see, so advanced. Okay, here we go. I do have a few sites to show, and I just wanted to kind of go through some fun highlights that I learned as I was researching Julia. Really going into this research and starting to work on this book is I did not know really anything about her except for seeing her cooking shows off and on, growing up, and also just knowing who she is as a food icon in the United States and worldwide, of course. So I found out she was very rowdy as a child, and she always instigated mischief. Like some of the things that she would do was throwing potatoes at cars driving by, stealing her dad's cigars and climbing a tree to smoke them. Of course, she got caught. In fact, as a little side note, her dad promised to give her a bond. I think it was like of $1,000 if she would not smoke. Um, and I think it was till she was like 21. And she just did kind of crazy, funny things, and she'd get in trouble a lot. She actually ordered a gun from the Sears catalog under her friend's brother's name. And um, she kind of terrorized her little sister, whose name is Dorothy, but went by Dort, but they became the best of friends as adults. She did love cats. She loved dogs as well. And throughout her lifetime, she adopted stray cats. She was a natural athlete. She was tall, 6'2", and she was great at golf. She was great at tennis. She also played basketball. Basketball was not her favorite, though. She did end up working for the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which is kind of the forerunner to the CIA, what the CIA eventually became. And she met her husband, Paul Child, while she was serving in Ceylon. He was also working for the OSS. And her first impression was that Paul Child was short, which he was 5'9". He was balding, and he was balding, and he was old. So he was 10 years older than her. She was 33 when they met, and he was 43. And later, of course, she decided he was very handsome. So they finally did marry after the war, when she was 34 and he was 44. And the reason I kind of bring up their ages is that this was a little bit of a hangup for her, especially when she was falling in love and very interested in him, and she didn't know if he liked her back because she felt kind of young and inexperienced and naive compared to all of his life and worldly experience. Oh, and another side note is that Julia's younger sister ended up being 6'4". So they're a very tall family, and she did have a brother, Jack, and he was, I think he was about 6'3". So here is some of the behind the scenes research. One of the things I do as a historical novelist is I go to, of course, nonfiction sources. There's kind of a a thing that we talk about, or I talk about with other historical novelists, is that we aren't the historians, and we're not going to necessarily be the expert in all things about the person we're writing about. Otherwise, it would literally take 10 years to write a book. But we want to do enough research in order to write a good story and in order to get the information to kind of flesh out the story so that you feel like you are immersed in the era. And so the first thing I did is well, I go on Amazon or eBay and I try to find any biographies. And depending on the person, sometimes there are quite a lot. Like when I wrote a book on Queen Victoria, there were, I think I bought around 9 biographies on her. And it sounds like a dream just to read for your job, but it can be very intimidating as well because you know you're not going to be retaining all the information. You're going to retain some of it. And so the way I kind of work around that is, and I know this sounds religious, is when I get a biography, um, is I will mark it up. I'm annotating, I'm underlining, I'm circling, I'm writing notes in the margin. And then when the book is annotated, then I type up all of my notes. And I've actually sometimes hired like my daughter or my sister to do this for me because it can take maybe 10 hours just to type up those notes. And then I put all these notes from all these different books into the same document so that when I am writing a scene and I have to describe Julia meeting Paul Child for the first time, I go to all of these different so I do a search in my document, I find where they've met, then I open up all the books and I reread those chapters, and then I can kind of create the scene with more accuracy. Of course, with historical fiction, with fiction, you do have leeway, but I've done 3 books this way. 3 of my historical novels are actually biographical novels, which essentially means there are no fictional characters and there's no fictional events. So the book that I wrote on Julia is biographical, and I do have like um, leeway as far as like creating the dialogue and moving the plot forward sometimes faster than maybe it happened in real life, and maybe kind of jumping through the timeline a little bit. But you're basically getting a lot of accuracy in the story. So these are several books. The Appetite for Life and Deary, they're just lovely reads. Like I felt like I wasn't even reading um well, not that biographies are boring, because I do love biographies, but I felt like I was just engaged the whole time reading both of them. And I also went into the OSS side, the kind of intelligence undercover work that Julia does. And so I found a book that is written by Elizabeth McIntosh, and she actually was in the same area with Julia Child during the war as well. So there's connections there. And then A Covert Affair was very interesting because this covers a woman, Jane Foster, who ended up being kind of prosecuted for um, maybe having some Soviet ties or communist sensibilities. And Julia and Paul both knew her. So that was an interesting book to read as well. And I mentioned the cats before, and I found this lovely book just on Julia's cats. And of course, I had to buy it. So it didn't add a lot to what I was writing, but it was just fun to read. So, and great photographs too. So just to kind of start kind of the beginning of where my story starts, is I have a part 1 and a part 2. Part 1 covers Julia's war years, and part 2 covers the years that she falls in love with cooking and works on this cookbook with her 2 co-authors. And I ended up being really grateful that I didn't do the whole book on her war years, because there's a wonderful story out, or a wonderful book out there by Diana Chambers that came out. Um, I think it came out a little bit before my book, and it's called The Secret War of Julia Child, and that one just focuses just on her war years. So I felt like it was nice because now these books complement each other and you can read them both and get different things out of the stories. So in 1942, after Pearl Harbor happened in 41, Julia she started working for the Red Cross in her hometown area. She grew up in Pasadena, and that's where she was when Pearl Harbor happened. And she also applied to the Waves and the WACs, which is the Women's Army Air Corps. And she got rejected because she was too tall. And anyone over 6 feet tall, and I don't think she really knew at the beginning, but she realized as soon as she got rejected by the first one, she'd probably get rejected by the second one. But she was pretty anxious. A lot of people that she knew were joining the war effort, and she wanted to do something more than just going to a Red Cross office and kind of doing paperwork. And so because she had actually lived back east when she had gone to college, she had gone to Smith College, this her mother's alma mater. She had a lot of connections back east, so she ended up moving to Washington, D.C. She stayed with a friend for a few days until she was able to find something to rent. And she kind of just took the first job she could come, which was basically being a file clerk. And then she got burned out of that pretty quick. And then she ended up working under General Bill Donovan at the OSS. And a few people in her area were going overseas. And so she was very interested in traveling. She had never traveled outside of, I think she had gone to across the border in Mexico, maybe once or twice. So she hadn't really gone off the continent before. So she applied to work in India, which she got accepted. And it's interesting because they put the women on a train with hundreds of soldiers, and they went all the way from Washington, D.C., all the way into California, where they're going to catch the ship. And from my research, it said there's over 3,000 men on the ship and there are 9 women. And they put the 9 women all into one cabin. So they had triple bunk beds, and laundry, washing their clothing was being very creative. They had to get very creative. Um, so they all finally got to India, and the commander that was over the OSS there said, we don't feel like we want women in India serving in these capacities because we don't have safety measures in place. So all the women got divided up and sent to different places, and that's how Julia ended up in Ceylon. So in Ceylon, this is where she met Paul Child, and she also got introduced to a lot of things that she really hadn't involved hadn't been involved with yet. Is she fell in love with Chinese food. And she and Paul, as they were just really good friends at first, and they would kind of take off when they could, and they'd go and eat in any little cafe or eatery that they could find. Paul was huge into literature, and he would read to her, he would lend her books. Paul wrote poetry. He actually wrote poetry to her as well. Um, he was also an artist, and he spoke multiple languages, including French. And he had completely different political leanings than her father and what she had grown up with in Pasadena. And so her eyes were really open. She had all these new friends from all over the world with all these different experiences, and she just kind of had her world opened up. They end up, of course, the war ends and the OSS is disbanded. Everybody eventually returns home. Paul returns to Washington, D.C., where his brother lives. He's looking for a new job. And Julia goes home to Pasadena, where her widowed dad, remarries. This kind of frees up Julia from feeling obligated from watching over him as much. And she's a little bit unsure of if her war romance is going to translate to post-war romance. But she and Paul just start writing letters to each other. He decides to come across the country, and he spends a week with her family. And then they decide they're going to drive from California all the way across the country, basically spending an entire month driving and stopping at places. And they end up in Maine, where Paul's twin brother has a cabin, and Paul's twin brother, he's married with I think 3 children at the time. And so that's when they kind of seal the deal. They realize they're in love enough that they are able to withstand each other on this big road trip, and they decide to get married. So they get married in 1946, and the day before they're to get married, they get in a pretty serious car accident, where they're both fine, of course, but Julia has a big bandage on her head when they get married, and Paul's using a cane to walk. So, but Julia does not want to call the wedding off. She's waited this long. Julia's father, he gifts them a new car that they call the Blue Flash, and it ends up being shipped over to Paris with them. They first spent a couple years in Washington, D.C., with Paul working, and Julia adamant that she is not going to be a secretary. She's not going to be a file clerk. She'll pretty much do anything, but she also does not really have the skills to be a housewife, because she in Pasadena, her family was quite wealthy. They had a cook, they had a maid, and they had multiple country club memberships. So she kind of grew up in a environment where she wasn't necessarily taught all these homemaking skills. But her sister-in-law is a very good cook. And since Paul and his brother, they had all lived in France for various reasons. Freddie, who's his sister-in-law, she knows how to cook French food. So she kind of walks through Julia with a lot of cooking lessons, and Julia tries stuff at home. She burns things, and she just has a lot of kitchen disasters. So more times than not, they end up over at Freddie's eating dinner anyway, because they all live within a couple blocks of each other. Paul gets assigned to Paris to work there. It's a State Department job. And so Julia, of course, is excited for this new adventure. She knows Um, no, no French. I mean, she learned some French, of course, in school, like a lot of us do, but doesn't mean you speak it at all. And they, as soon as they get off the boat and they, with their blue flash, they start driving to Paris and they stop along the way to this little restaurant. And this is where Julia Child has a fish dish, saumon meunier, I'm saying it right, for the first time. And she described this in an article later on that said, eating that dish was like an opening up of the soul and spirit for me. It was perfectly browned in a sputtering butter sauce with a sprinkling of chopped parsley. And she just felt like she had been transcended into another sphere of life. And I loved reading this about Julia Child because if you've seen her cooking shows or you know her personality, you can just see her just being so excited and so enthusiastic about eating something that tastes so delicious. She falls in love with French food. She falls in love with Paris. She takes French lessons. She's determined to not be the American that is saying everything wrong and not able to understand French. And so she takes this seriously. Whenever her husband has a day off or weekend off, they go on field trips around the city and they visit every restaurant, every museum, everything they can. And in 1949, she decides that she is so invested in learning how to cook French food after kind of stumbling through some of the big French cookbooks she picked up. She enrolls in Le Cordon Bleu and she wants to learn to become an expert. So just a quick note on this. So she does very well. She ends up in the beginning in the housewife class where you're learning to do very basic things and she knows how to do the basic things. So she talks to the director of the school and they put her in a class that's for the GIs, American GIs that um, are taking cooking classes because they want to open up, their own restaurant or something down the road. So she joins, she's the only woman in the class, and she meets the chef Max Bagnard, and he kind of takes her under his wing, um, and she becomes completely obsessed. So her husband makes a very modest living. Julia does have an inheritance from her mother, and she also gets an allowance from her father. So she has some kind of extra play money a little bit. And so she invests it in buying things for her kitchen and eating out at restaurants when she has kitchen disasters. So these are two women that she meets in Paris, Simone Beck and Louisette Barthal. And so they have been working on a cookbook that's actually going to be published by an American publisher. And the editor kind of keeps sending them edits and says, you guys need to find an American co-author because the way that you're speaking and presenting, it's not going to translate to American cooks. So they're impressed with Julia and they ask her to help revise some of their explanations. And so in her mind, she's thinking, oh, I can kind of help with this. But when Julia starts reading through their pages, she realizes this is going to be a lot of work. And but she decides to take it on. She doesn't know what she's getting herself into. In 1953, so they're in Paris for about 5 years. In 1953, they moved to Marseille, and Julia is now fully working on this cookbook, and she has discovered that she wants to write a cookbook so that every single thing is spelled out. And so a recipe is not going to be a half a page or one page. A recipe is probably going to be 8 or 9 pages because Julia is going to write it as someone that has never made that dish before can now do it step by step and do it well and perfectly at the end. So when she gets to Marseille, she decides to focus on her fish chapters because she lives right next to all these fish markets. So she's in the markets every day and she's talking to all these fish sellers, and she of course just loves it there. That's just her personality. She makes things work even when they're hard. And eventually her husband gets transferred to Germany for a couple years, and then to Norway for a couple years. And it was in Norway is where the book is finally completed. But this journey is almost 10 years. And the original American publisher they had was Ivis Washburn, and they ended up, so the editor left the company, and the editor was the one that was champion the project. And so it kind of fizzled after the editor left. And so in the meantime, Julia had formed a very close relationship with a woman named Avis DeVito. And so Avis had a connection with Houghton Mifflin. And so Avis helped pitch the book to Houghton, and they were very interested. And so so it's kind of a 6-year process of Julia sending them chapters and getting edits and back and forth, back and forth. So when the book was finally done, it was hundreds of pages. And Houghton eventually just said, this is too big and you need to cut it down. We're not interested in doing multiple volumes of this cookbook. So then that's when Julia and Simone and Louisette, they spent another 2 years like selecting, cutting out recipes, but then adding other recipes. So the reason it took so long is they were testing these recipes over and over, and Julia would send out recipes to her friend Avis, to her sister Dort, and to other friends for them to test as well. Some of the hard things that Julia dealt with was is she found sort of early on when she was in Paris that she was using French flour to cook with, and which was a lot different than American flour, because American flour was the kind of flour that would stay on the shelf for a long time. And French flour, you had to use it pretty quickly because it didn't have all the preservatives in it. And so that was a really hard shift for her because she had to actually buy flour from the Army Depot to use, and she had to use only American products. And like, for instance, if like certain seafoods weren't available in America, something like goose was not a common thing to buy in America. So the French dishes with goose would have to be altered or left out. And so she was dealing with that a lot too. Um, so after Houghton, and I hope I'm saying it right, Houghton Mifflin officially turned down the book for it being too long. Julia just didn't know what to do because this is kind of the time, this is like the late 50s when frozen meals are coming out with like Swanson, and canned meals like Campbell's cream mushroom soup, like those things were becoming popular to cook with. And Julia was just frustrated thinking, my cookbook may not have a place for American cooks because they're looking for convenience right now. And my recipes aren't art, and they take a long time to prepare. So Avis, though, in America, she also had a connection with Alfred Knopf, and she took the cookbook there. And long story short, Alfred Knopf ended up offering on the book, and they're the ones that published it. And that is what started Julia's career as a well-known cookbook author. So the official release was October 1961, when Julia was 49 years old. And then she ended up doing a second volume down the road. Just she and Simone Book did it together without Louisette, and that came out in 1970. So volume 2 has a lot of the dishes that they had taken out of their original version. And the thing with Louisette is she kind of went through a lot of difficult times. So the beginning of the cookbook, like, she was all in, she was helping, she was doing a lot. But the last few years of this cookbook project, she had gone through a terrible divorce. Her husband incurred a lot of debt, and then he had fled the country. And she just had a lot of turmoil in her life. And then she ended up getting arthritis pretty severely in her hands. And so they basically kind of bought her out of the contract. So the second book she wasn't a part of. Simca wrote a couple more books too. So in February 11th, 1962, so this is just a few months after her cookbook came out, is that she was invited to a local public television program called I've Been Reading, and this was a local to the Boston area. And basically, she was invited because she was an author and she was a local author, and they couldn't pay travel or pay appearance fees. And so they were just looking for someone local. And she didn't want to just talk about her cookbook as might be interviewed. And so she brought um, fixings to make an omelet, and she asked the television station to provide a hot plate. And so she demonstrated making an omelet on this public news station. And interestingly enough, is the news station got hundreds of letters and phone calls saying they want to see this again. They love this show and they love Julia Child. And so the producer cleared it with the higher ups, and he came and offered her a test pilot show. And so they did 3 test pilot episodes, and those were successful. And then they decided to make a regular series, and they called it The French Chef. And even though Julia said, I'm not French and I'm not a chef, but that was what we called it. And they ended up running for 10 years. Anyway, and this is just another thing that I thought was interesting, just from an author standpoint, is that there was really no marketing budget or publicity budget from the publisher. And they had gotten her a spot on the Today Show. She did have a great write-up in the New York Times, and they did get her a couple cooking demonstration spots. But she and Simca was in America for the launch. They just contacted everybody that they knew across the United States and asked them to connect them with any place they could do a demonstration, like a ladies' club or a bookshop or a museum or anything that would maybe be interested in her coming. And that is really, and she did that from October through the middle of December. And she kind of just put together her own speaking and demonstration tour and just really sold this cookbook from the ground up. And after the French Chef, they ended up doing 3 more shows, and they did them in her kitchen. And so she had her kitchen kind of outfitted for this. In fact, interesting enough, some of you have probably been able to go and visit her kitchen that is now on display. Is her counters are higher than the average counter to kind of account for Julia's height. If you see on the back right of this photograph, you can see a pegboard where she has pans and different things hanging off. And this is something that Paul had actually started when they lived in France, is Julia was buying so many kitchen implements that they didn't really have shelf space. And so he was the mastermind behind that pegboard. Oh, here's a bigger picture of it. Yeah, so it's in the Smithsonian Natural Museum of American History. And I have not been there, but it's definitely something I want to go to. So Paul retired right after their Norway assignment, and he became Julia's kind of full-time assistant. And because of his photography skills, a lot of his photographs would make it into Julia's cookbooks down the road. And he was the perfect guy just to get the lighting right and to help her through all of her PBS shows as well. And he always was timing her as they practiced the segments before she would film. Anyway, this is just kind of a fun side note. Is I Googled a couple weeks ago just the phrase said I met Julia Child, and like different stories and articles start popping up, because I thought it'd be interesting just to hear from just the average person that met her on the road or some other way. And I came across this article from a Canadian food writer, Marion Kane. And she just shares meeting Julia and hosting Julia in Canada. And she had asked Julia, have you ever been to Canada? And Julia said, no. And Marianne said, well, why not? And Julia says, no one's invited me before. So Julia just, even in her 80s, she just had this wonderful sense of humor, just wonderful, warm personality. And was just the kind of person who just kind of didn't live with regrets. Like when something happened, you just accept it, move on. And I love that about her. And many of you may know this already, but the French Chef episodes can be watched on YouTube. It's very fun to watch them. I went through and I watched a few of them. And in fact, as I was writing the last chapter of my book, um, I I was trying to get like the exact dialogue that she would use at the end of the show. So the exact dialogue, she would kind of say the same thing at the end of every show. So that is part of the end of my book. So no spoiler, or maybe it is spoiler. I don't know. Um, so just kind of in conclusion, her legacy is that she co-founded the American Institute of Wine and Food in 1981, and she created the Julia Child Foundation for Gastronomy and Culinary Arts. She is also awarded honorary doctorate degrees from numerous schools, including Harvard and Brown University. She also received many awards, including the Emmy and Peabody Awards, the Medal of Freedom, and the French Legion of Honor.
Oh, wow. That is amazing. When did she actually die?
So she died, I think it was 2007. I'd have to look it up. Sorry.
That's okay. Um,
Yeah,
she had a good long life. Okay, so
yeah.
I have reopened the chat to
2004.
everybody.
Someone
Oh,
just posted 2004. Okay.
I love my audience. Okay, so the chat is for if you guys want to chat with each other about any comments you have. But if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, which is, like I said, that button at the bottom of your screen. Barbara wants to know, did the two co-authors feel like they didn't get the credit they deserve for the book? Because their names are much smaller in the book, but it was their idea.
Yeah, it was their idea. And I think that and I think as I researched, Julia did do quite a bit of the work as far as testing the recipes. The recipes definitely, a lot of them came from kind of family recipes of Simca and Louisette. But Julia was the main contact, and I think Simca through the whole process, she was doing all the testing with Julia, but Louisette is the one that kind of dropped off. But they felt like they couldn't just shut her out because it wasn't her choice to like pull back as much.
Mm-hmm.
So the royalty was split three ways. Um, and then as Julia was the only one that was doing the cooking shows, but for those first two books, Simca was still and Louisette were still benefiting from getting the royalty, even though Julia was kind of working full time doing these cooking shows.
Hmm. Interesting. A couple of people want to know if you've seen the TV show series on Julia Child. But there's lots of documentary shows, movies about Julia. Like, did you see the TV series? Did you like it on Max? And if
So
are there
yeah,
others that you like?
I haven't seen the TV series on Max, but I did see I watched that show with Meryl Streep, Julie and Julia. I mean, I saw it when it came out, and then I rewatched it, and I really loved. And it had been after I'd done a bunch of research, and I was really impressed with. They really did stick very close. There's like things that they changed were more just flipped around, not like wrong as far as the Meryl Streep character. Yeah, but I haven't seen that one on Max. I did have a couple friends tell me about it, but I didn't have Max, and I think I was just trying to get through the book and not get distracted when I was writing it too much. But yeah, so I
Okay.
mostly stuck to just the biographies with my research.
Hmm. Well, it does. Susan's question is, what? How long did it take you to write your book? So that's falls right up into where you were.
Yeah, so I spend about 6 to 8 months writing research. So researching and writing, like researching maybe like 4 to 6 weeks, just full researching. And then as I'm writing, I'm still researching. And I live a little bit of leeway in there. So I could have like readers go through it and then my agent goes through it and I submit to my publisher. Um, so I'm usually writing from like January to like July and then turning in the book by September. And then it comes out a year after that. So even though I'm turning in the book, I don't always have my chapter notes done or maybe my afterword or my forward done. Like so I just kind of turn in the main book to get it through the committee process. And then as it's going through that process and I'm finishing up chapter notes, because that could even take another month or longer just to do those.
Hmm. Um, I had a question for you and I completely forgot. Sorry, everybody, total brain freeze. Um, Patricia actually has this question that I also have for the war effort. Do you know what she actually was hired to do? But like, why did she want to join the army or the military of the war effort anyways? I mean, she had a
Yeah.
comfortable life at home.
I honestly think it was her age. I mean, she was in her early 30s. I think if she had been in her 20s still, like maybe a little bit younger, she might have been feeling, like she could stay home and just, her mother had already passed away, so her dad was, widower and all this stuff. And so um and I just think that she just got caught up in kind of that feeling of we have, if I can do something, I'm going to do something. Um and she, she's in her 30s, and I felt like she felt kind of just that courage and that bravery of going to do something. So,
Hmm. Well, people, like to make an impact,
yeah.
and be remembered, I guess. Um, is it true that Julia was not interested in making French desserts at first?
So, so she did not put French desserts in her first, but from what I remember looking through it. Well, she might have some, but she didn't put like the traditional like pastries and stuff in there. And and I think she just had so many things to do, like even like her cocoa van recipe, like she'd have all these alterations. So it was just like page after page. But yeah, I just remember that that wasn't like her expertise.
Hmm. Well, she certainly had a lot, right? She
Yeah.
can't do everything. Louise says, I remember reading that her papers were indexed in an educational institution. Do you know which one, Smith versus Harvard or another? And if yes, did you access any of these documents?
I did go to Harvard or online, and I did access some of her papers through there. I didn't do it through Smith's, but it's very interesting because there's a lot of her letters at the Harvard website, and so you can read stuff in her handwriting, and so that makes it kind of more personal, I think. And she was a very fantastic letter writer. I mean, she was always writing. In fact, when she was writing by typewriter, she would have like multiple carbon copies, so she could like send the same letter to multiple friends, like five or six of them.
I must be old because I remember doing that too, or something like that, but nobody's going to ever read my letters. Papers went to Radcliffe, interestingly, getting some comments here. So, a couple people, actually, a bunch of people want to know what exactly did she do for the OSS in Ceylon? Was she spying? Who were they spying on? I know that there was a whole thing with Paul about spying.
Yeah, so she was a person where she would get pouches from all around the world, and they would have information in them. And so she would have to connect the information with like the right person, so that the right information got to the right person. And so she was definitely in a very high level, kind of top secret information that she was privy to. She wasn't specifically spying, but when she was actually in Washington, D.C., she was she would help purchase stuff like different fish and different shark, and they would use like the shark oil and the fish oil to like try to create food products that maybe someone could eat if they're stranded on a raft or their plane goes down somewhere. So she would like go to the fish markets and buy stuff. So she was kind of like a jack of all trades, but actually in Salon, she did work kind of in an office environment, and it was just mostly paperwork coming in and making sure that this paperwork went to the right person in the OSS.
Mhm.
And she knew that if the information, and it was very timely, so she was actually working 7 days a week a lot of the times, is because if the if the next person didn't get the right information, then it could kind of botch that undercover or spy job. So she wasn't personally out in the field spying, but she was dealing with all the like connecting between the spies.
Interesting. A bunch of people also want to know if you tried making any of Julia's recipes. Are there any recipes in the book? Did you? I know you were busy researching and writing, so did you have time to cook?
So I have a recipe from her mother in the book. I couldn't use the recipes that are all copyrighted in her cookbooks, but I did buy almost all of her. I have a lot of her cookbooks. So I was going on like eBay because I wanted like the original 1961 versions of her first cookbook. Um, and I did try Coco Van. It was okay, but I just no, it wasn't like probably how she made it. Um, and what was the other one I tried? Oh, and I did try that. So in the second book, she has a French bread recipe, and it's like 20 pages long or something. So I did try that one. It was okay, but I also feel like it wasn't, and sometimes it's just when you cook yourself, it's not as good as someone else cooking for you too.
Oh, absolutely. I've never made coq au vin, but I sort of feel like everybody should try it once.
Yeah.
So somebody says, and I have a couple of comments here about somebody, worth catching the YouTube Dan Aykroyd's hilarious impression of Julia from Saturday Night Live. I've always loved that one, Tish. But Patricia also says you don't mention how funny she was and how encouraging she was to cook. So like she didn't mind that people made fun of her. She thought it was. I think I read somewhere that she thought that was very funny. She thought it was like not honoring her, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. She was a really good sport, and she was a very funny person. And that comes through in her shows. And she's very positive. And she just always just was a friend to everybody. Doesn't matter who you were, she was a friend to you. And in fact, when she kind of when her first cookbook came out, she didn't really know very many people like of the other chefs and cooks and stuff. And James Beard was the one that he threw a little launch party for her, and he just really embraced her and brought her in, and they became really close friends. And she just, wherever she went, she was just very kind to people. In fact, she was known for staying at book signings for hours. She was adamant that she was signing a book for every single person that came and talked to him for a second.
Hmm. That's what comes across is she was just very warm and
Mhm.
authentic. Christina wants to know what made you interested in researching and writing about Julia? Who's your next historical biography about?
So, so it wasn't really that I thought, oh, Julia Child. It was more I was writing a World War II story kind of they wanted me to write someone that was an American. This is just a conversation with my publisher. And the year before, I had written a book about the WASP, the Women Air Force Service pilots, and that story all took place in America. And so they wanted something that was World War II, but not kind of, you know, the traditional, not traditional, but just there's so many stories that take place in Europe, and I just, of course, feel very intimidating by that. I those stories because they've been done so many times and done so well. And so this gave us an opportunity to write something a little bit different. Um, but like I mentioned a little bit earlier, is I felt like it would have been a disservice to the readers if I just focus on her warriors. So that's why I
Hmm.
kind of split the book into two parts.
Hmm. Um, does your book span Julia's whole life or mainly focus on a certain aspect of it or a certain period? Like, is it just about like mostly her cooking and her rise to being a cookbook
Yeah,
author?
it's pretty well. It's 20 years of her life. It's pretty well divided. Part one is just I think is about half the book too. Is when basically it starts really soon or really close to when Pearl Harbor happens, and she joins the war effort and she meets Paul, they fall in love, and she spends all that time with him. And then part two is when they first arrive in Paris. But I forgot to answer the previous question. Someone said what I'm working on next. So my next book that comes out is called Her America, and it's actually about the women's suffrage movement. But it kind of covers different women, starting with the Revolution, women who really changed America. And so it includes 8 different women, so it's kind of 8 different sections in the book. And then my current project, which I should be starting any day, is I'm going to write a historical novel on Coco Chanel, not necessarily her warriors, which she was in Paris during the occupation, but her comeback in the 50s. So she went into exile in Switzerland for about 9 years, and then she came back and started competing again in the fashion world. So
Wow.
that's my next to do.
It actually brings up a point in your bio that I thought was really interesting is that you write primarily historical and her story fiction about the humanity and heroism of the everyday person. And so, like the stories you're talking about, Julia Child, Queen Victoria's, suffrage, it just brings to light a lot of things that we just didn't know, right?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and it's definitely been an honor to write about women because I feel like it just inspires me in my own life to see, because we hear about their like amazing successes, but as you do more research, you realize, wow, life was hard and they still had a struggle, and if they can do it, maybe I can do it too.
Yeah, it's like the social media, like everybody puts their best pictures up, so you
Yeah,
don't really know all the
yeah,
challenges they went through.
yeah.
Cheryl goes back to the oils and said it's documented that Julia Child developed shark repellent.
Yeah, I
No
think I
idea.
remember reading that. Yeah. It's pretty amazing. I mean, you think of like this war that's broken out, and all of these like innovations that came out of it, all of these things that we have now, we still don't have peace in our world today, but all of those, there's so many developments, especially with airplanes during World War II. I think that was one of the biggest curves of development in technology.
Hmm. Louise asks and says, not to be morbid, but was she buried with Paul?
No, I just found this out like a week ago too, because I was trying to find more pictures that weren't copyrighted. And so I went to like Find a Grave and Family Search and Ancestry, like these kind of genealogy websites. And I discovered Paul, his ashes were distributed to family and friends, so he doesn't have a burial place. And Julia Child was buried at the I think it's Neptune Reef in Florida.
Oh,
So it's an underwater burial site. So
that's interesting.
I
I
almost
mean,
put anyway, really interesting. So she just must have thought that was been a really fun, fascinating place to be buried, and that's where she is.
well, you did say she loved the fish markets.
Yes.
Um, I love her episodes with Jacques Pepin. And Jennifer asked, "Did you touch about on her friendship with Jacques Pepin because you had a picture in, I think, your slides of the them together?"
Yeah, I didn't in the book because I basically ended the book right after her very first the French chef
Mhm.
episode. So I didn't go into that history. I mean, really, I could have written 3 books on her if I would have kept following her.
Um, well, there's a lot of books
Yeah,
about her, so it's hard to
there
find. I'm
are.
sure
I know.
like the original, but I think you kind of did it. Cheryl wants to know: does it include information about Alice Paul?
No, I don't have I don't I think yeah, that one I don't have a lot of kind of extra. I just kind of it was actually that's actually one of the hard things about writing a historical novel is who to include and what storylines to kind of follow.
Hmm. Well, how did you choose? At what point did you know that you were going to be doing these two, like, real focus on the cooking and her time with Paul at the beginning?
Yeah. I think it was probably just within the first few chapters that I was writing, and also as I was researching, is like if I had a biography, I'm like, well, if I'm just researching her warrior, I don't need to read the whole biography because most of them get into the cooking part pretty quickly. So after the first couple chapters, I emailed my publisher and I said, "Are you okay? I know we talked about this kind of World War II novel, but I want to take it into the 50s and 60s in her life." So they were fine with it.
Well, obviously, we are enjoying it and the product of it. Um, Barbara wants to know if you've written about or looked into writing about Hedy Lamarr.
I haven't. I think that would be really fascinating though.
Hmm.
So yeah,
She was
I definitely
she
think.
was also like sort of a scientist, right?
Yeah.
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 So, and the last question that uh, you're such a prolific writer. You said in the last 20 years, you've published 90
Mhm.
publications. I don't know if they're books or articles or things like that. But Patricia wants to know, in terms of writing, how do you keep consistent in your writing over this long haul? Like, how do you must be putting out like two, three things a year at least.
Yeah, I probably write about 3 books a year. So I definitely take breaks. And and this just works for me. Every author is going to be a little bit different. I just break it down by word count. And so on average, when I'm actively writing a book, I'll do 2,000 words a day, 5 days a week. And then I take get 2 days off, just like you would, kind of a 40-hour week job. And I have found that if I do the word count, and I actually write down the word count at the end of the day, and it helps me it helps me keep the manuscript moving forward at a good pace, but it also helps me stop. Okay, you did your 2,000 words, now stop and do something else. But sometimes those 2,000 words, I could do it. I mean, if you're just typing, you can do it like in an hour. But when you're writing and crafting, maybe 3 hours is kind of average, but sometimes it can take almost all day if I have to stop and do certain, research again, or if I feel like I'm really stuck, sometimes I will go back and read, a few chapters to try to get the flow again, or maybe I'll write a future chapter that I already kind of know what I want to happen in a future chapter. And then hopefully by the time I get there, I don't have to revise as much as I think I might have to.
Okay, so I lied. I do have another question. So are you a pantser or a plotter? Like it sounds like you're more towards a pantser.
Mhm. Yeah, I would definitely say I'm a pantser, but when you're writing historical, um, based on, an already established plot, I mean, you're kind of in between because you are trying to hit those plot points, but when I sit down to write, I don't really know what I'm writing the next day. So it helps me to read what I wrote the day before. And then sometimes the ideas will kind of come as I'm reading that. Or the other thing I do is as I'm writing, I think, oh yeah, I got to remember to put our cat in. So I just make a note the bottom of that page. And then the next day as I'm writing, I'm like, oh yeah, you need to put the cat in. And so I'm having ideas in advance. And I don't always know how where the book is going to end. So a lot of times I'll get to like 90,000 words and I'm like, this book has to end and it's not ending yet. And so sometimes I turn to my books over word count and then I have to go back and trim. So
Mhm.
I always think just write an 80,000 word book and it just never ends. I mean, some of my books are, some of my like other genres are definitely shorter, but
Mm. I can imagine being able to just, whip that out, but it's impressive. We have a couple more minutes. Are you okay with a couple more questions? Okay. Who's your favorite author? Louise wants to know.
well, oh my gosh.
I thought it
Um,
would be tough.
Yeah, I like a lot of authors. I'm trying to think of some of the stuff I've read recently. Um, I just read a book that is on um who wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? Remind me the
Yes,
name.
Lewis?
Yeah, C.S. Lewis's wife. Yeah, and I can't remember the author's name, but it was called Becoming Mrs. Lewis.
Ooh.
And so anyway, I love that book. Of course, that doesn't really tell you who my favorite author is, but I just read a lot. I read recently read a book by Rudis Septis. That's how you say it, Rudis Septis. The one that is set in the 80s in Romania. I thought that was really interesting.
Mhm.
And I don't know. I don't know what to say. I when okay, so growing I'll just say I don't know about as an adult. Like growing up, I read all the time. I love Mary Higgins Clark. I loved her mysteries.
Oh
I
my
actually
gosh.
met her in person once.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome. I loved her. What was it? The When the Child Sleeps or something?
Oh
Oh,
yeah.
creepy.
Yeah. Yeah, like the cradle will fall or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
There's like the stranger is watching. So I loved all of her books. I love Mae Binchy. She wrote just kind of women's like kind of friendship stories. She's from the
Mhm.
UK. Also Anne Perry. I read a lot of her books. Um I just read all over. I read like The Hobbit, I read The Lord of the Rings, I read Nancy Drew. I read anything that was in my parents' basement, like Tom Clancy. Like half the stuff is over my head, but I was reading. Louis
Where are the
L'Amour. I like
children? Yeah.
Westerns.
Jennifer says, "Where are the children?" Yes, that was the
Oh
spook,
yeah.
creepiest book I think I've ever read, and that was like in the 80s. So when does your next book come out? I know Julia just came out, or like last year, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when
Yeah.
are we going to?
So Her America comes out in August. And then if all goes well with my Coco Chanel book, it'll come out in a year, like fall 2027. So
Well, I'm going to have to be in touch about this suffragette book because it sounds amazing. And we'll have to do this again, hopefully.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Thank you so much, Heather. Like I said, I've been looking forward to this for months, and it is even better than I ever expected. Thank you all for your wonderful questions, and I hope you all get this book and read it and enjoy it. Heather, have a wonderful night, and I'll be in touch.
Thank you so much.
Good night, everybody.